City Commission and the Oregon City Planning Commission to particularly discuss one item, that is the downtown circulation study. Welcome to the Planning Commission members. Actually, I think because we're new, why don't we do introductions? I'm Alice Norris, the mayor.
I'm the official president.
Hi, Chris Brunner, Planning Commission.
Carter Stein, Planning Commission. David Frazier, City Manager.
Rocky Smith, City Commission.
Daphne West, City Commission.
Charles Kidwell, Planning Commission.
I'm City Recorder. With the rest of the staff. Introduce yourselves.
Dan Bretlaw, Economic Development.
Great, thank you. With that, let's launch into the study. And who's starting? Nancy, are you the introducer? Yes. Nancy Bretlaw, our State Engineer and Public Works Director. Nancy.
Thank you. As you know, we've been working on studying the downtown circulation over the last year or so. It became an active conversation as the city became more involved with ODOT in learning about the plans for the Highway 43 Arch Bridge Restoration Project and learning about the two-year closure for it and trying to have a better understanding of the impacts of that on our downtown. And also looking at it, so we're looking at it from a short-term standpoint, that is during the bridge closure, and then also looking at more of a long-term, you know, what's good for the city in terms of the circulation being either one-way or two-way on Main Street for the long haul. We were fortunate to have received a grant from the Department of Transportation Growth Management program. And so they are funding a study. They selected Crandall over Ambula, who do planning and economic development type projects for, well, they've worked all over the states and all over the state as well as the states. And so they've been the main consultant on the project, looking at sort of the economic, business, Main Street impacts of two-way versus one-way circulation downtown. And then they also have a traffic consultant on the project team from DKS and Associates who's with us tonight too, who's done all the traffic studies and making sure to see how the intersections would work depending on any modifications downtown. So we have the staff report gives us a general overview of the project, and I won't spend time on that, but we do have a fairly comprehensive presentation for you tonight. And I'd like to ask you to welcome Jason Graff and Donna Rambula from Crandall Rambula, and then Carl Springer from DKS and Associates, who will be going through the presentation for you. I'll be inputting comments here and there. And I think we want to handle it in a somewhat informal manner. If you have questions as we're going, we'd like to have a very informal discussion, but we do have a 1 hour limit, so we've got to kind of keep an eye on the time too. So would you guys like to start?
Even though we have a formal setting, we do Zoom work sessions, so we don't use titles and we normally do in a regular meeting. So welcome to our meetings.
Thank you. Again, I'm Donna Rambula. This is Jason Graff. Carl Springer, who really did all the real heavy lifting of the technical work from the traffic engineers. So if it's a technical question, he'll know it better than we will. And also from the state is Rachel Fedorowski, who is really the one who got this done from the DLCD. So if there's some state issues, she can probably answer that too. So let's roll with this. We've got a lot of slides, and I just want to roll with that. So feel free to pipe in if there's something that isn't clear. A little bit of background information, how we got through this piece, and then the proposal, Jason, to take care of that at that point. We're going to do a little tag team work here. So again, here's the program, the DLCD. Can everybody hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. And this was the idea. It really is to work with ODOT, which is really key in this project, and the Department of Land Conservation and Development, really to think of these roadway projects as more as economic development, simply just moving people through your community. So this is a good program. We worked on numerous of these through the state. So here's the study area, and the idea is really to look at those core streets that you see outlined in pink, And then think about the land use implications for those areas outlined in yellow. So essentially from McLaughlin to the bluff. Okay. So the agenda is to look at these goals and then look at the refinement plan and discuss it. The discussion part is the key, so we're going to move through it. So the project goals will look like this. Explore the two ways Nancy said. Look at ways to improve and simplify circulation. And there's a sense that you can't get there from here in downtown. So how can we fix that and really improve your retail shopping district? The idea then is to identify some specific recommendations for not only the cars but also pedestrians, and then look at some alternative modes. So not only think about cars and walking, but bicycles and transit and everything else goes in your downtown. And then look at also a way of how you move forward with this and implement. It's great to have a plan, but if you can't implement it, it doesn't sit on the shelf. Who wants that? So the process and schedule looks like this. There's 4 steps that we have, and you see those listed on the left. And it started really with some reconnaissance back in December, taking a look at a site on a real rainy day, and then also meeting with some the public, and we did an opening workshop with that. And there were a range of comments that we got from the community here. And it's all summarized. We can do that to you, but when we look at it, there were the top 3 comments that were really identified. Look at curbside parking, off-street parking. This is business people. Facilitate local access and then strengthen downtown businesses. So these are all consistent with the project goals, so nothing new was found out here. From that, we did some background transportation work, working with the DKS to get a sense of what the existing conditions are, and then also look at projections while the bridge is under construction and being renovated, and then long-term, what this is going to look like in the future once you get things done. And then we looked at a series of alternatives. Always a number of ways of doing it, and the idea is then to identify different ways of looking at circulation in the downtown. And those were then presented along with some additional analysis back in August. And so that August concept started looking like this, and you can see some ideas were looked at for all modes. And I won't get into a lot of detail of this because it's been updated, but this was really essentially the preferred alternative for the plan elements that came out of that. They're looking at a concentration of actions. So after that, there really was some need for some additional research, and brought it back to another public workshop on September 8th. And so additional elements then were looked at, looked something like this. Again, looking at some access and intersections and alternative modes. We'll get into some detail again. So on September 23rd, there was some additional technical analysis done by DKS to look at some of those concepts, mostly looking at geometry of the roadway, and also then are there some movements that are problematic, thinking about congestion. So some of those were identified, and there were some findings as part of that. These are all a part of the document that we have, and we don't want to get into the details of this quite yet. Okay. So here we are on October 12th, and the idea is to get your comments in this before we bring it back to the City Commission hearing on the 20th. So this is, hopefully we've got enough time to do that. So hopefully it's close enough for minor refinements. So here it is, the general circulation refinement plan that we came out. And so when we started thinking about this, there were some basic issues that we wanted to look at. And there are 6 of these, and I'll go through some of the issues and then some ways that we responded to each of these. So the first issue had to deal with downtown retail success, improve Main Street's drive-by access and visibility. And that's a key component for making a successful retail street to ensure that your growing downtown gets even better over time. So we do a lot of retail strategies around the country and in Canada, and retail is very formulaic. You either got things done right or you don't do it right. It's not sort of an art. It's really much more of a science. So there are these series of things that you need to have, and it's arrayed around the circle here, and you really need to get them all. But this study really, at this point, is going to look at the things that are identified in green: convenient auto access, shopper-friendly parking, and high-quality pedestrian environment. You need to think about the land use component of that, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of this project. So that's another time, another place. But these are the key sort of metrics that we look at for retail success. So starting with convenient auto access, these are the things that all successful main streets have. And that is the sort of, it's a Goldilocks and the three bears sort of thing. You can't have too much or too little of it. You need about the right amount. So when we look at this, we think about 5,000 to 15,000 cars. So if you hit that sweet spot, that right amount of traffic, where it's pedestrian and friendly, but enough traffic so that you got enough people who are going by the front doors. So those are the numbers that have worked for us around the country. So what's some examples of that, where you've got two level? So when you look at it through a Truthful Village down in Wilsonville, they tried to create a main street down there, but they didn't design it very well for auto access. As a result, they get 1,000 average trips a day. So as a result of that, 5-6 years later, they have this condition, blank storefronts. So we don't want to do that. So the traffic is important. So then you think about the low end of that. So you see emerging main streets, and if you've been into Portland and looked at North Mississippi Avenue, that's just at the bottom, 5,000 average daily trips a day. You look at Southeast Belmont, looking at two-lane streets here. Okay, so something similar to what you have in Oregon City. Southeast Belmont in Portland, 10,000 average daily trips, still in that sweet spot. And you start pushing the edge, you're at 23rd in Portland, 12,000 daily trips. So you get these sort of conditions that are really good for retailers. You got a bus going by, you got bikes in the mix, you got cars on street parking. And for a retailer, this is not about moving through the town, but arriving at a destination. So the traffic crawls through here, but that's an ideal condition for a retailer. They like this sort of condition. Once you get past that 15,000, you get these sort of conditions on Hotham. 17,000, that means 4 lanes. A little busier and a little less friendly. Okay, so it gives you a sense of what we're looking for here. So then looking back at the information that DKS assembled for us, you can see how those streets relate to that 5 to 15,000 criteria. So where you see green, those are meeting the criteria. If you see the red, those are outside the criteria, largely below the level we want. And black indicates areas where there was no information. So you see there's a patchwork of some green streets and some red streets, so it's a column. So what are the solutions to deal with that? Well, if we would like to get more main street traffic and get it up into that area, one way it might be to do this would be to do two-way streets. And so the proposal was that we look at with being two-way, travel from Pacific Highway down by the mill all the way up through downtown, at least the 12th and beyond. So that would be a two-way travel. And so what does that do? Well, here are the benefits of two-way, and this has been documented by a number of traffic studies throughout the country. And the key one of this is highlighted in yellow, increases drive-by exposure to businesses, okay? And so there's some other ones you see listed there. We'll get into that. So when we did this analysis, DCAS looked at this. The technical analysis of does this create problems by going two-way? And the answer was really, no, it doesn't. Really, the two-way traffic is feasibly got the capacity, and you've got the ability to deal with level of services generally at all intersections, with maybe some congestion at 7th and the bridge. Okay, so that would be some of the issues that we need to deal with. And then even looking forward out into 2035, to meet all the standards, even long-term, besides short-term. So it's a good short-term solution and long-term, as long as we can deal with some of these congestion issues at Main and 7th. Okay. So when we started looking at those numbers, the thought was, now, if we could get it to two-way, what is the effect of that? So you see green, again, is indicating that traffic volumes in that sweet spot, 15 to 15,000. And it's just right in the middle. You can see this traffic volume 6, 7, 7,000, and 8,000 as you get closer to 10. So that's all good news from a retailer and a downtown business vitality standpoint. Okay. So the second part of this is to deal with not only the car and drive-by, but how are you dealing with the sidewalks and safe crossings for pedestrians? So that's a high-quality pedestrian environment. So typically when cities are traffic engineered, you see this sort of prioritization of vehicles and pedestrians. Pedestrians get the short end of the stick. What I try to do is really, the successful downtowns really reverse that equation and say the pedestrians are most important, the priority. You need to provide adequately for bicycles and cars, but you really think about your downtown differently if you start with pedestrians first. And what does that mean? As a result of that, we find that we have highly biased pedestrian environment, investors are attracted to those pedestrian-friendly streets. So what does that translate into a pedestrian-friendly street? So ideally, you would like to get this. And the idea here is that you have zones on your sidewalks, areas for street furniture, lights, flower pots, newspaper stands, bike racks, all those things should go along the sidewalk. And to accommodate that, that's typically about 4 feet. And then if you want to have an active environment where people are sitting outside at cafe tables and other things like that, you need about 8 feet because you need to clear a zone for people to walk out and people to sit so that you're not weaving and jiving and juking around them along the street. And what you have in the downtown today is probably not ideal, frankly. You'd really like to have 12 feet of sidewalk, but there are maybe ways of dealing with that condition. But just let you know, that is not an ideal condition. And so what would be ideal would be able to widen these sidewalks. Unfortunately, with the timing and the cost of this could be very considerable because you have to deal with drainage, you've got some electric units, signalization. It could be very expensive. So this issue, and at this point, is how can we make the sidewalks as pedestrian friendly with the existing conditions as they are, considering you don't have the time or maybe cannot afford that cost to do those changes to make that ideal. So what we'd like to do at a minimum is do this, enhance pedestrian environment at intersections, because those are the conflict points and we'd like to address that. So there are really 3 things that we'd like to see, and this is what we call tabling intersections, or in other words, extended the sidewalk through the intersection so the pedestrians don't step off the sidewalk, but there's a sense that the sidewalk moves through intersections. Yes. Yes.
You rushed by, if you could go back, you kind of rushed by your timing and cost
For this.
issue, and I'd like a little more detail on that as to why you think that Oregon City, I mean, where we stand today, there's a timing and cost.
Well, the timing and cost issue is that we're trying to deal with some projects that we need to, when we start talking about the implementation as we get into the presentation, some things need to happen short term, and then we need to adopt some things for long term. The issue is what we want to do for short term improvements, we don't want to have to tear out and rebuild. So we want to keep the project moving forward. Well, it's not ideal to have it's not ideal to have a tinted sidewalk. We think that we can deal with it and make it better, but it may not be ideal. It's just reality.
What are the parameters that are governing your use of the word timing? I mean, is it the fact that the bridge is closing? Is it the fact that we've already invested and we were already tearing up the streets on this Main Street project? I mean, what is both of it cause you to say we don't have enough time?
The timing is that we'd like to get some things done by the end of the year, which is essential, and then the cost of those, to get those would be considerable in cost. It's not a minor cost to move a curb line. It's a major cost, and it may have some implications as part of it. However, we have done some cost estimating in it, and that's part of the appendix material. So if you're interested in those costs, certainly we've got that available for you.
I just wanted to add to that, in terms of timing, there's the other aspect of it is how much can you afford at one time? And say if you can, because of the much higher cost to do 12-foot sidewalks, we probably there's no way we could do them all at once. We could even do them in 2 phases. So then you have this, the timing is, you won't have the sidewalks all done together. There'll be some done, it'll be a patchwork, the drainage will be kind of odd. And then just to clarify too, the work that's being done on Main Street today is actually a stormwater and sanitary sewer separation project. So we're not doing sidewalk improvements.
Okay, let me follow up this, and I may be jumping ahead of you, Don, because you may be going to answer my question here. Does our Main Street, as a matter of its current dimensions and width, permit 12-foot sidewalks in the future if we decide to do it,
Yes.
over a span of years?
It depends on what you decide, what are your minimum standards for lane widths. So today you've got about 14-foot lane widths. If you narrow those down and added some width to your sidewalks from the lanes, you could do it. The point is, it's not ideal, but there are good examples where 10 feet is done, and it's done pretty well. So if you've been to Hood River, for example, they have 10-foot sidewalks, successful downtown. But it's not ideal. You're limited to lots of sort of your outdoor cafe seating, but there are other additional approaches at how you can deal with that. as far as a setback or, other ways of dealing with some of those issues, it becomes a problematic thing for you. So it can be dealt with, but we just want to go with this with a clear eye. And the view is that if you had to start over, you'd probably want to have 12-foot sidewalk, but you need to deal with this issue.
And there's also the historic aspect, because the sidewalks have always been 10 feet downtown. There's another little thing about is the 10-foot travel lane. That is getting quite narrow. Now, it's okay for me. I don't mind having 10-foot lanes, but it is getting very tight, especially when you have on-street parking, doors opening, bicycles. I mean, it's trying to cram a lot into 20 feet with no shy distance for the parking or the travel lanes. And so it's something that we've been kind of talking about. And one other little item I'll move quickly is that sometimes we can deal with this sidewalk space with architecture. For example, the remodeled the Caulfield House. What they've done is they've designed it so that they can open up their walls so you feel like you're on the sidewalk without actually being on the sidewalk. So those are just some ideas I think that Don was alluding to.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things that we want to be aware of, that we're not, because this is by multimodal access, not only cars, but we need to at least, as we look at the ideal condition for the automobile, we need to also look at the ideal condition for the pedestrian. And we may need to make some compromises for all modes to make this all work. Okay? So the second part of this is dealing with those intersections that we talked about, starting with what we call cabling, continuing the sidewalks through the intersections, curb extensions so we minimize the crossing distances, and then reduce corner radius, so that also helps that. So what's an example? This is a project we just recently completed in Montana. Here's an example of what we're talking about, that sidewalk continuing through the side of the intersection. So as a pedestrian, you see through the use of materials and grade that it isn't a stop and start for the pedestrian. They continue through the intersection. When we talk about field intersections, this is really about raising the intersection up, sometimes as little as 4 inches, to meet that sidewalk. So then you just walk at level. And this has a lot of universal access, handicap issues, and surprisingly, even maintenance issues works better for this. We find in for example, snowy areas, the plowers, the guys with snow plows appreciate this more because they don't run into the curb. It's actually a better way of going about it. And so the curb extensions look like something like this, and the idea there is to reduce that crossing distance so you have a small distance to cross and less conflict for pedestrians. The corner radius is tight as possible, considering that you should be designing for the appropriate vehicle. Designed for a UPS truck rather than a 18-wheeler. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here that we're trying to illustrate here, reducing those distances where you can do it, where it's reasonable. So the cabled intersections, there was a plan there's some that have already been planned, by the way. So there was one already at 10th and also down at the coming down the elevator where you see those open circles. And so there's some proposed areas that are indicated by yellow circles. The only issue on that is that this roadway in part will still be controlled and regulated by ODOT, and that would happen as 7th and 6th. So that those would probably be a later phase, pending some approval by ODOT as they go through a process, an additional process. When we think about the bridge itself, there's also some ideas that were thought about as far as the alleys that are adjacent to the bridge, and they're kind of wonderful spaces that they could be treated better. So I think some of the long-term planning has thought of connecting the river all the way to the elevator, and this is sort of a missing link. So the idea here would be to eliminate vehicle access, except for maybe loading vehicles and emergency vehicles, and really make this a pedestrian-friendly alleyway. So the area would be in through here, and largely limit your auto access from McLaughlin only. So you come into that parking that you have under the bridge at that point. So these could be some wonderful spaces that would be a nice connection down to the river. Maintain curbside parking and provide off-street parking is another issue. So as you know, you just go to two-way, and it has some profound implications on your existing angled parking. Developer-friendly parking is the key that we look for, and there's some things that we look at as a basis of when we start looking at parking plans for downtown. We know you've got an adopted a parking strategy for your downtown, and this is largely consistent with that. So what we do is start looking at a successful typical Main Street. And that typical Main Street usually is about this long. So it's a walkable distance where you see about 5 blocks of development, and it's edged by retail development. It's typically about 60 feet deep. Your building's a little deeper, but to work this out, we see typically modern retail has this, and you have anchors at each end. So that gives you an area of about 96,000 square feet of retail. And that would require about 180 spaces if you wanted to compete with the malls. So you need a lot of parking. Frankly, as walkable as we want it, you need to have an adequate amount of parking. And you can provide that for this area, even though your demand might be about 480 spaces. So when we think about this, when you've got your on-street parking, you're going to have a shortage of about 300 spaces, so you need to find a place to locate that. So your on-street parking is, when we think about it, is we describe it as a 35% solution. You can never park all your parking that you meet for an ideal situation on street. So your long-term strategy, as you've discussed in your parking plan, is to identify some off-street lots, and even when you get very successful at some point in a parking structure that serves your retail areas and needs to be located correctly. So in the short term and long term, we want to make sure that we preserve and enhance the curbside, because that's the most important parking for any retailer. Because if you're like me, you'll come downtown and you'll circle around the block and say, hopefully I won the lottery today and I got that parking space in front of the business I'm going to. But if I don't get that, I got the ability to go around the corner to go to a lot or someplace else. But you want to make sure that you preserve that on-street parking and add to it wherever you can, that you've got spaces in front. It's not necessarily the amount that you have in front of a retailer, but the ability to get some. So, because you can't, as I mentioned, park it all on street. So the approach here was to do what we described as a no net loss parking, curbside parking in your downtown. So what we're suggesting is that there may be some loss between 7th and 9th Street by going to two-way because it's currently angled, and we want to make that up somewhere else in your downtown. So we wanted to maximize that on all other block bases, and there's a couple ways we think we can do that. So here's the proposal for Main Street curbside parking. It'd all be parallel. We get rid of all the angle. So the idea here is if we can eliminate some of your loading zones, some of your bus bays, and some of the other things. In fact, we think we can come up from this stretch of road on Main Street itself, we can gain 2 spaces, surprisingly enough. We've got a lot of wasted spaces, got alleyways and other things like that that we've maintained and worked into this also. So the second part of that is a strategy long term is to say, where would you park off-site? And so we know that in your parking plan that you've identified some sites that you might do some shared arrangements with your existing owners. And long term, you really need to reserve some areas for public parking, and those are indicated in yellow here. So there's a series of those.
Before you go to buses,
Yeah,
Don, my lingering recollection, and people can correct me if I'm misremembering, was that in the parking study, they calculated that we could solve our parking problems without a structure.
Well, that assumes that you have your current growth. What we like to do is to assume that you're in plan for success. And so if we were able to get the amount of retail that we indicated of 96,000 square feet, which is pretty consistent with a regional center that you need to have to be a retail draw. If I was a retailer and I did a national study and said, I want to draw national tenants into your downtown, they will only go into places where there's a critical mass of at least 96,000 square feet. Ideally, it needs to be about 125. So it expands your market and who you can recruit into the downtown if you've got the ability to have a lot of retail and you've got the reserves identified for on-street parking. So it's important to not only identify strategies that your parking study did for providing parking for existing uses in a growth pattern that assumes some modest growth, but if you want to plan for success, you need to really identify some sites that are a little bit larger that can accommodate a parking structure. So that's just, not to say that you're going to build it, because it's very expensive to do that, and it costs a lot. But there are few and far between its site for a parking structure because the geometry and the configuration requires you to have certain width and length to it. And so what we identified down below the bluff are two areas, one adjacent to McLaughlin and maybe one along Railroad Avenue that would serve it. And it can't be 5 or 6 blocks away because, like everybody else, once you get out of your car, you're not going to walk that far, as much as we've been told in the past you would. People need that at a fun, close to the main street.
Can we get some more numbers from you? You said, as far as downtown being a regional center, what was the required square footage of regional?
Well, what we've identified here would be a good number, 96,000 square feet.
And what is the downtown now?
And I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head, but it's
Lloyd, do you know?
a portion of that.
No. Okay, so 96,000.
Yeah, and that's about a 5-block area. So you can accommodate that into your downtown. Okay. So when we start talking about getting parking, one of the issues has to deal with the buses, because bus pullouts equal a loss of curbside parking. And in fact, we know with our conversations with TriMet, the pullouts in fact are not even desirable. They prefer not to pull out of traffic because it slows the buses down and they have to pull back into traffic. So the idea is if we can locate those bus stops at curb extensions, which we're providing, it's even better for TriMet. So it's a win-win sort of situation. So the idea is, where can we do that? So we know that we see that circle between 6th and 7th, that could be moved out. And then you have your trolley. And the thought would be, that's a great service that you have right now. During non-operating hours, let cars park there. So that gives you quite a few additional, and that's especially good because then you've got for down evening hours and other times, that's a great reserve to pick up some more parking there. Okay. So then finally, the circulation idea, we need to look at turning movements at Main and 7th. So this is a study that we looked at. An issue has to deal with large vehicle turning movements, your big trucks going through camp, essentially. They are not necessarily coming downtown unless you're a beer truck or a UPS vehicle. We need to deal with those. And then the left turns from the bridge, when they occur, may cause delays. So this is the current condition that you all have near and dear to your heart. All this traffic coming off of the bridge from West Lynn, and you see that typical backup at peak hours. Now that doesn't happen that often, but it's enough that becomes an irritant. So we need to deal with these worst case conditions.
You missed an urgent there. You missed the person coming back to the elevator trying to turn left.
Yes. So here's the big issue from the design standpoint, the geometry of this. So because remember, we're making this two-way. And today, as you come off that bridge, you can use both lanes to, especially trucks, to really swerve around and then come back and around. Now, if you've got car traffic coming the other way, you lose the lane. So the big trucks, the question is, can we make that fit in the road? And if it does, how does that impact this zone for the pedestrian? Because we can always tighten this radius up, but is there any sidewalk left? So that was the charge that we asked DKS to take a look at. What are the impacts of that? So what we've done here is color-coded that. So here is their template that they looked at it. So this is a vehicle for a truck turning that corner. The top is the bridge, and to the left is southbound on Main Street. So what it's indicating with that red arrow on the top is that it's an impact to the pedestrian zone that we think is too severe, that maybe not worth doing. At the green arrow shows that you can't keep that traffic in the 2 lanes. This is designed for a larger vehicle here, okay? So then the bottom illustration says, well, let's preserve the pedestrian environment and maybe let's swerve the traffic to the south. And you can do that, but what that does is that removes the parking on this block here, because then you have to swerve back up. So you could angle this side, but it's not ideal. So that there is a trade-off here. So the issue is we don't really like this. If we're going to go to 2-way, we need to find a more creative way of dealing with this traffic, because in a sense, this is a non-starter. This is just not acceptable. So, as we say, not acceptable there. We also looked at it on westbound, and generally the conditions are a little bit better, obviously, because you got a little bit more area to turn. So the top one for the truck, you can make it work for the pedestrian, cutting into your existing curb extension, but we're going to cut that back anyway. Okay, so if you were then to really moved to the south, you could also do that too. So we've got two conditions, but it's less extreme for going northbound on Main. So what we said is let's modify or restrict turn movements on the bridge in 7th Street to avoid that whole problem. So what can we do to get trucks through the downtown without creating that mess at that intersection? So here was analysis that EKS did, and it looks something like this. Large vehicle turn movements impact on street parking and sidewalks. So what you can do is restrict right turns for trucks and buses and reroute the trucks and buses from that intersection. The other piece of this is to expect major vehicle queues on the bridge approach. And what do you need to deal with that? Okay, so there's some restrictions as you see listed here. We'll get into more detail here. So this is just a list for you to take a look at it. Okay. So here's the idea. At that intersection, instead of allowing those trucks to come off the bridge and turn left here, right here, and left here, let's just run them straight through. So what you have on 7th Street today, let's make that a two-way street and run those trucks and bring them around the corner to Railroad, a very wide street here, and bring them back down, and then reverse the direction of 6th, and bring them back to Main. So what we've done essentially, where you've got this roundabout circulation pattern today, we've reversed it in essence. We've reversed it so the trucks can go this way, and cars can make that turn. So what we need to do is figure out a way to sign that so it's very clear for trucks to know that they can't go that way. So we can do some physical things by putting some restrictions on the corners through physical barriers, bollards, and other things that we can do on the curb. But ultimately, we need to be able to sign it correctly. So when we look at this, this is looking from the south to the north side of the bridge, and you can see this is what we're suggesting for movements. Okay. And what we'd like to do is reroute those trucks to not include, have it do this, and those trucks would do that. You see again here. So the issues that is starting to emerge is what do you do with these corners to get the trucks around it? Because are we just transferring the problem? And that was one of the issues that ODOT started asking us when we see this two-way traffic movement and reverse the flow. Of course, we've got this little planter in the middle that we have to deal with too. We'll talk about that in a second. So what we said is to do this, you really do need to do some modification of these corners to make it work, and also probably of this parking in through here too, okay, to make that work. We think that could be done. And the analysis looked at it, and then we'll get into that in just a second. So beyond that, we said the downtown bicycle accessibility needs to be improved too. So we've looked at the cars and trucks and pedestrians. So what can we do for bicycles so we can get that? We'd like to see a lot more people cycling through your downtown. So today, this is what you have. You have signed routes. Essentially, it's a sign on the pole that says it's a route. Not much of improvement other than the signing. So you see that on Main and on 7th, and you can get up and down the elevator. So the thought was to incorporate this thing that we call sharrows, or a shared roadway for bikes and autos along Main and then the bridge. So the idea of these would be the new special routes for bikes through your downtown. So you see that indicated in blue. So what are the design requirements for this shared lane or sharrows, which is kind of an odd word, but it's a sharrow is a designation on the road, and I'll show it to you in a second. So there's some requirements in the design manuals that the traffic engineers take a look at, and they are this. They're only applicable for roadways of 35 miles per hour or less, which means your downtown is, Main Street is eligible for it. And the bikes would share the lanes with the cars, something like you see on 23rd. So what does it look like? Here's that sharrow. It's got the bike symbol with the little chevron on top of that. And those occur once or twice every block. And they could even occur on a bridge, some instances. This is a mock-up one of the St. John Bridge. This really isn't there, but we use this as an example of what you might do on a bridge. The sharrow is a symbol. It looks something like this when you place it. And it's typically at the start of the block, and you see one way down here at the end of the block, so that those are indicated here. And sometimes, if you have a traffic congestion at intersection like 7th and Main, you use something that's called a bike box. If you've been to Portland, you might have seen some of these. There are these green blocks that hold the traffic back so that the bicyclists are always visible to the stock vehicle. And then there might be some additional signing, such as you see here, that would be added to that. So it's a full array of things that could do that. So the key piece of this, we think, is really the connection onto the bridge, because you know there's 5-foot sidewalks and you really can't share a bike and a pedestrian. So going over the bridge really is probably the key piece of this, is to get those sharrows on that so that cars can anticipate the cyclists on it. There's some other considerations that we also thought about long term for your improving access into your downtown. One of those had to deal with maybe a left turn. This is part of your adopted enhancement plan. Again, this is more of a long-term project, but as you know, if you're coming on McLaughlin and if you don't turn at 10th, really there is no clear indication that you can get into the downtown until you get back down to Main by the Mill. So the thought was, and this has been approved as part of your adopted McLaughlin plan, sometime in the future you need to revisit this and come back and think about possibility of getting some access improvements for autos and pedestrians at 8th Street. So this is just a little reminder for that. There would also be helpful in your downtown as a next step is also to look at some additional two-way streets, because it's a bit confusing for you enter your downtown on a one-way street and you're confronted with a street that forces you to make a left or right turn. So we suggest some further investigation of two ways on these streets that you see indicated, especially 8th and 9th and possibly 6th. Maybe a little bit more difficult over on 6th to do that because of geometry, widths, and maybe some circulation issues that we haven't investigated, because you've got a corner on the roadway there on McLaughlin that you'd have to deal with. But at a minimum, look at those arrows that we were indicating here. The pedestrian alleyways, again, the other piece that we talked about, not in addition to along the bridge, that you've got some opportunities for maybe some funky or special spaces that could contribute to the success and the character of your downtown once you get your Main Street up and going. So these are sort of your phase 2 projects once you've got a healthy Main Street retail environment. And if you were to do some things on your alleyways, there's some requirements we'd like to see. One is keep it lighted and well lit at night. As you can see indicated here as an example, this is down.
We do have commercial vehicles that actually get into those alleyways. I can understand you can block it off for parking because they could still have access off of railroad, for example.
Right.
I think it'd be kind of a challenge for the owners of those retail buildings in particular, also restaurants.
And I think we want to make sure that we can maintain the access. So this is maybe not the ideal planting arrangement here because you probably can't get a vehicle in here, but we do want to make these very pedestrian friendly with lighting, and we want to make sure that there's some windows and entries into it if you're going to do this, so that it isn't just a blank wall. And then clear sight lines to your parking. So if you're going to have parking, these are great ways of getting access to that. So something similar to this is in Pasadena, where they've incorporated some alleyways as a phase 2 of a successful Main Street program down there. So, so we say maybe restrict the vehicle access, is your point here, to deliveries and service vehicles. And maybe the everyday auto access is not here, but it's just service vehicles, so kind of what we have here. But there's ways of doing that with a card date or some other ways of dealing with that. So the next piece is I'm going to pass it off to Jason. Probably heard enough of me, and I'm going to let him talk about implementation.
I'll try to bring you to the end here. And Don's really set us up for what are sort of the critical elements. This issue and the final issue is really the bridge restoration. How do we implement the street improvements knowing that the bridge will be closing, and how we successfully do that within the 2-year period while it is closed. So it's important for us to think about what we can do now for the day, January 15th, when the bridge is closed, and then what that means in the long term, so that improvements that we do in a first phase don't have to be redone in a later phase, but are actually sequenced and work together. So what we've identified are what we call near-term projects and 2013 projects, 2013 being the year that the bridge would be open. And the near-term projects really have to deal with this closing date of January 15th, 2011, and what the impact of that loss of 15,000 cars a day will mean to Main Street. So we know that issues to address certainly are that drive-by traffic and visibility and on-street parking. We had Carl look at the implications of bridge closure on your main street, and you can see that the traffic numbers are pretty dire. When we're looking for totals between 5 and 15,000, we're seeing much, much lower volumes on Main Street, and that will have a profound impact on your businesses. That's existing one way. The good news is that just by converting to two-way, we're seeing more than doubling of those numbers, and we're getting a lot closer to what we think is healthy traffic volumes to support your downtown business. So that's the plus side, that if we can convert to two-way, we're going to see some benefits for visibility. Now, there's a couple things that will need to be done to implement two-way, and those are obviously removing the angled parking between 7th and 8th, and then the landscape island at 6th. By removing these elements, it frees up the roadway to then look at restriping, for instance, for two-way traffic between 6th and 9th. So with those improvements, with those pieces taken out and adjustments to the corners and removal of the landscape median, we can then restripe those blocks, and we'd have a two-way system then from Pacific Highway up to 15. The other issue to deal with is replacing the signal at Main and 7th, because as we know, it's designed today for a one-way system, and that would need to be modified slightly, either with a refinement of the signal or stop signs that address traffic flow from this new direction, that is traffic coming from the south to the north.
So the cheapest and simplest way that in the short term is just the stop signs there.
We know obviously that the ability to restripe your parallel parking has some advantages in terms of adding some of that parking that we lose by going two-way. You have angled parking today between 7th and 9th. With a two-way street, that angled parking will be converted to parallel. And how do we maximize that parallel parking so that you're not losing critical spaces on Main Street? So between Pacific Highway and 10th, we think that just literally restriping and designating for 2 hour, that's critical because 2 hour parking is important for your downtown retail. So we don't want extended long-term parking on Main Street. We want high turnover. And of course, we'll need to relocate the parking meters that you have today in the angled section between 7th and 9th.
Relocate or replace.
That's
Maybe
relocate or replace.
new ones.
In terms of the Main Street bus and trolley services, Don had mentioned earlier, we think that removing the bus pull-out between 6th and 7th will then give you the ability to add some additional on-street parking, and of course allowing for that trolley layout to be used after hours for downtown parking would be a tremendous benefit. We've also looked at fairly conservative cost estimate for these near-term projects, which you see here. It ultimately comes up to around $200,000. The biggest piece of that is relocating parking meters and redoing your curb extensions that you'd be replacing between 7th and 9th. But this is a reality check for us that there will be some costs involved in making these improvements.
I might add that cost estimate is for replacing them with new modern meters. So if you move them around for this temporary fix, it would be quite a bit less.
Would those new modern meters be solar?
And that's something you need to do long term. So instead of doing it twice, the idea is if we can get a reasonable cost, and the $208,000 seems fairly reasonable to get the things that are a long term project as an initial piece. It seems like that would be the right thing to do at this point to get the new ones in.
So we've talked about costs, we've talked about what the elements are, and we've put together what we think would be a likely schedule in terms of implementing. What are sort of the hoops we need to jump through, what type of coordination organization we need to put together so that we can begin doing these near-term improvements. And so we know, and we've been in the process of technical review and approval with ODOT, so we're sort of well into that process that you see as the first item. An additional element would be a traffic control plan. ODOT has designed it for your one-way system, and if you go to two-way, the signs that they put up during the closure period will need to be adjusted to address the change in traffic flow. And that would take a couple weeks for them to review that and then put together a new traffic control plan.
Are you done with your description of how to get more traffic on the two-way street in Main Street? Because can I make a suggestion? Because there was something that I thought was self-evident that I didn't hear you say. Okay, good.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Can you go back to your graphic aerial of Main Street?
will take a sec, but I'll get there. You want to see the traffic numbers or any area?
Well, yeah, so that number is going to be fine. All right. So you indicated that the mere fact that this is going to become two-way would in and of itself kind of boost numbers to the ballpark want, to 5,000 figure. But I don't know what the numbers are on 99, but that's a big flow of traffic. And if you want to get from 5 to 15,000, wouldn't there be some way to entice people to try there are a lot of motivations for driving, along 99. Some people are commuting, some people are touring. You don't know who is in each car and where they're going and why they're going and what their intent is. But it seems to me that if there were a way, like to form like a gateway of, a gateway arch or something really stunning at Main and Pacific Highway on the south side, and something similar, to get people, the director of a sign that says historic downtown Oregon City, that people would just be drawn out of curiosity and interest because they're in historic Oregon City to make their trip through Oregon City along that two-way Main Street rather than along 99.
That's something we have talked about with the Main Street organization. That's one of the projects we're kicking around. So we also agree that would be a really fabulous addition.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a great suggestion. I think that, it's something that definitely should be thought about.
We even decided to say Main Street open for business. The bridge is closed, but Main Street isn't. And it's important. So that's an excellent suggestion. And probably the right location.
So this discussion kind of went like this. We thought the numbers looked a little bit anemic. We'd like to see them at 7,000, obviously, during this period. But the thought was, let's give it a month or two, open it up, see if you can get a two-way, and then see if there's some additional ideas. So ODOT has some other ideas about railroad and other streets, some adjustments you might make there to entice, add on your suggestion. It might help. There may be an array of things to do, but our sense is by going to two-way, and our experience is that it in itself will draw some more traffic. So we think this might be a little conservative, but we're glad to see it's at 5,000 rather than 2,000 and 3,000. So if it doesn't look good a month into time, I think that's the time to start saying, are there some other actions we can do? I think at this point we think we're all right.
I'm going to jump ahead here to just bear with me one moment.
So the point is that none of these conversions have to be permanent if you do it in the short term.
We're setting us up for the long term, which is to have two-way and improve, maximize parking on Main Street. So we're not going to lose that once the bridge opens.
We would move in phases, but what we do spend money on, we would like to do it in a way that we're not going to redo it later.
So in the sense, keeping our eye on the final project as we make these short-term projects.
So again, I'll go through the near-term study here. We talked a bit about the review process with ODOT and potential change of the traffic plan. Obviously, today, the decisions you all make really set the stage for the marching orders for the city to begin implementation. And if you so deem, two-way important and the circulation plan is a potential viable option, it gives the city then the leeway to sort of move forward with what we would call the bridge restoration circulation strategy, because there's quite a bit of coordination that has to be pulled together between the city and ODOT, also internally to identify refinements to designs and how do you actually implement some of the things that we've identified. A physical plan is going to need to be put together on a schedule, so there's some work in-house that's going to need to be done. We think that roughly would take 4 to 6 weeks. And then hopefully the construction period may be a 4-week period. I showed a very aggressive timeline in that, in our mind, it seemed that the strength of your downtown, your shopping season occurs during a certain period of time, as we know, is at the end of November. And then if we were able to sort of move at an aggressive pace, could we begin these near-term projects, get them going, and have them actually implemented prior to that date? So you would be two-way, actually before the bridge closes, which is January 15th. but you would do it in advance of the most busy shopping time of the year.
So there's some other just physical issues of striping in rainy season and all kinds of other sort of just housekeeping issues that we have to deal with. But it is an aggressive schedule, and a hiccup here could be problematic. Not to say that you couldn't do it later, but I think that there's nothing like urgency to move a project forward.
We have only 15 more minutes
Okay,
left.
So that's about it.
So yeah, if you can summarize quickly, I want to make sure we have questions and answers.
Just a little bit more.
Yep, I just have a little bit, 2014 project, we'll hit quickly because there's some, again, the two-way is critical. What happens when the bridge opens? This is the green light. This is what looks great. Don showed you these numbers. You got an even distribution of parking serving your businesses when the bridge opens. Some of the things that will need to be adjusted, obviously, is the signal, so that is phased and designed for the new turning movement, the two-way traffic. The bridge turning movements, we're likely going to not allow left turns off the bridge, and then restrict the right turns for trucks so that we're rerouting them around the block. Traffic can be managed in a couple of different ways. It could be signage, it could be signalization. These are a couple of examples of how we might deal with, for instance, vehicles turning left or controlling trucks so that they're not making right turns off the bridge. Again, eliminating the vehicle access on the alley streets we think is probably a good idea, so that by bridge opening you're not moving traffic through that portion of the street, but you're looking at ways to improve the pedestrian environment for that section. Again, rerouting trucks will require you to do some two-way restriping on 7, on Railroad, and then reversing direction at 6. That would also kick in some restriping of your angled parking on 7th, which will have an impact on the number of spaces there, and you would need to reverse the striping on 6th because of the change of direction. So these are just some nuts and bolts things that we all need to consider. As Donna mentioned, truck turning movements will have implications on some of these corners, and they may need to be modified, but we think that the cost would be relatively low. They're not major improvements. And then, of course, the shared lanes, really creating a strong bike emphasis on Main Street and the bridge. Again, we have some costs associated with that. They're a little lower, which is potentially a benefit. And then this, again, is a schedule for your consideration. The city's done a lot of work in designing Main Street today with the curb extensions and replacing sidewalks, and we think that design work will just need some modification to match the recommendations that we've identified in this circulation plan. We think likely you would want to have a public review period for the public to see sort of the refined plan, and then move into construction and bid documents so that you're able to implement these last phase of improvements by opening day. So.
Enough said. We're taking up more time than we need.
First of all, is the planning commission going to be hearing this? Is this coming from the planning commission, Jim?
No, the initial resolution was coming to the city commission, and it is for the short-term improvements with the general description of the longer-term improvements. I've talked to the city attorney, and they indicated that it's not a major decision. It can be, this kind of thing can be approved by the city commission with a resolution. That's why we wanted to invite the planning commission here tonight, so that they would know what's happening.
Good.
And we'd be happy to come back and do more presentations with them. It's not only Andrew's.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure that the planning commission tonight got a chance to be heard. So if we could vary speakers, that would be great, starting with the planning commission. Is there anyone that wants to begin?
So I'm curious about Don's discussion about the longer term plan, and then we have something to do right away. I'm just curious if there's going to have to be modifications to the transportation system plan based on these new ideas. When that might happen.
Some of Main Street improvements are already in the transportation capital improvement program, and this again, these improvements were suggested to be added to the capital improvement program for the TSP. We're also going through a TSP update next year, and we could probably fold. It hasn't been, the attorney's office hasn't said we had to actually do a major revision to the transportation system plan for these improvements, But, given the fact that it is a change in circulation for the downtown, it'd be prudent to make sure that's included in the TSP update.
And as people come and go, it'd be good to have these changes identified in the plan so they're not forgotten. The other thing that I guess is of concern are the safety issues, and I don't know what the accident rates have been for automobiles and pedestrians in the area. But the ideas that you suggested about moving the sidewalks into the street, for example, or the sheriff's system for moving bike traffic through, are those things that could be done short term or mid-term, or are they strictly long-term ideas?
We thought the sheriffs could happen sort of during bridge opening, or it could be in an interim phase. I mean, you basically have 2 years, right? You need to plan this thing out, and so the actual date that you put that on the ground, the bridge is one thing. You know, you're limited to access to that till it's open, but Main Street.
You can move forward on that, and it's just an issue at this point of approval with ODOT on the bridge, and that's going to run its course through their approval process. But it's something I think that it is the most logical solution at this point to deal with that.
Now, the Main Street from Pacific Highway to the 7th is under ODOT jurisdiction, so that portion of it is dictated.
Yeah, I noticed in presentations that in discussions we had in Main Street on this, you did talk about the impact in terms of change of the number of parking spaces. I don't think you mentioned that in this presentation. I think it's interesting. So, I mentioned it yourself.
What the impact would be for.
I'm definitely interested in all this stuff. What's going to happen with your change of parking spaces? You're going to have less or more or what?
On Main Street, you're going to have
a gain of 2.
Yes.
Gain of 2 minimum, and that I was assuming that for the most part the alleyways would be left intact. So I wasn't counting alleyways as a parking space in that 2 gains. So you potentially have more if you decide that the alleys could be closed to a lot of traffic and parking.
So, but there does need to be a more detailed work that looks at all the side streets, for instance, are going 2 ways and 7th and Railroad, to say what the impact will be for your side street parking, because that's an issue that you need to deal with at some point. But for Main Street, we can gain 2. We suspect that we can have a no net loss also on the side streets by going 2-way. We do it well.
I had a question that you kind of went through the schedule alternatives pretty quickly. Do I get it that you had one schedule that would implement 2-way change before the Christmas shopping season and the other would be after?
Yeah, we really have one schedule, okay, that was really a critical path schedule that says you need to do the 2-way. As a short-term project. Okay, so there's that.
Only on Main Street.
On Main Street.
7th and 9th. We wouldn't do 7th Street. It would be really quick and dirty on Main Street for 2 blocks to get that 2-way.
My biggest concern was with the curb extensions that you were talking about removing in the planner, how that fit into that type schedule, because that's a lot of work to do in just a few weeks.
I think it's very difficult. I'm going to be honest with you. It's what we would love to happen, but I think it's more realistic to say that we try to move it as aggressively as possible, but there's a good chance we still be working on things after the bridge actually closes, starts to work. And I think that's reasonable. It's not perfect, but it's reasonable given you want to do a good job.
It seems like that ought to be taken into account as part of the work plan, because I don't see realistically how you get that work done in just a few weeks.
It would be tough, but the idea is really to push that way, and I think we're trying to be aggressive in realization that maybe it is the construction extends over until the spring, but at least let's get the ball moving on this, get a 2-way, and I think that the retailers in downtown would really benefit from that, and they may have to deal with a little bit of construction delay.
I can't see that the island could be there and have a 2 and not
Well, we could take that out. The issue would be the curb extension construction.
Yeah.
The demolition is fairly quick. It's the rebuilding.
So you have some temporary pavement.
Possibly. I think that's a detail that needs to be worked out. We try not to do that because that just means more cost is something we want to remove and it's temporary. We want to really look at permanent pieces right now. It would be an option.
So I guess my real concern, well, one was, I was going to ask the same question about the net gain loss of parking spaces, but with this kind of a proposed timeline, and what level of discussion have we had with the downtown business owners? And that's always come back to bite us in bad places in the past, I think. And I'm concerned with looking at this timeline probably being one of the most aggressive that I've seen. And really the ability to have a good conversation with business owners, because I don't think it's intuitive when you think about going to a two-way and losing your I mean, you just I promise we're going to have a net gain or a no net loss, and this is going to be better. I think it's going to take a little bit of conversation and buy-in, and that needs to be addressed or built into the plan. I don't know how maybe we could do that, but
we've had series of meetings with them, and can we get more outreach? Yeah, and Lloyd.
Do you want to come up to the microphone? I think on the schedule you first put in, I think we had 3 meetings.
Chris, to answer your question, Lloyd Purdy from downtown. Crandall O'Reilly has been outstanding about keeping communications open with downtown business owners, many surveys, many public meetings, and several of you have been to some of them, I've been to all of them. With that said, let me remind you that 2 things. Yes, an aggressive schedule, because our other partner in this project, ODOT, only responds to deadlines, so it's incumbent upon us to set some aggressive deadlines. 2, we're talking about returning to the two-way Main Street. The way Main Street used to be when it was a retail downtown, and we're rediscovering our retail character downtown. Many of the business owners and property owners who have been there for hundreds of years, like the Bushes, say, oh yeah, we remember when that was that way. We loved it. I think what happened was when the county was operating downtown, we returned to a one-way Main Street to create parking for county services. We no longer have that need and that capacity, so we are in fact returning to a concept that supports retail downtown. With that said, Chris, not every business owner loves the idea. Any business owner that's going to lose a parking spot in front of their 15-foot window front either doesn't like the idea or isn't quite sure. It's an issue of do we, show leadership for the health of all of downtown. But they've done plenty of outreach.
Leadership, but also at least give them the opportunity to have their voice heard and maybe even some of their concerns.
We've done surveying, meeting 3 at least.
Announcement.
Yeah, I've done, I did as much as I can do, even personal visits, and I still continue to do that. We can keep up, but we've probably hit the threshold on that.
But in 5 more minutes,
I want to defer to plan.
No, okay, you're next.
I was just wondering what the difference. I couldn't remember the difference in numbers on 5th and 6th Street before with it one way and then with it 2-way, and I saw that it only after the bridges reopened did they hit over the 5,000. But I just couldn't remember what the numbers were. So how much of an improvement is it for the down that?
It's a little low. I think it was about 3,500 before the bridge opens, but I think that
So it's
so this is one way, okay. And then if you go to 2-way, it's close. See, 4,500 is close. It may be a rounding error. So, and I think if we do some of these other things that have been suggested, signing and other things to encourage traffic, we can get that number up. But we feel a lot better about that rather than something that's way down in the 2,000 numbers.
and when the bridge reopens, that's when the big
Yeah.
payoff comes in. Because that is the section of downtown that's, needs a
That's
little more help.
dragging behind everything.
Yeah, dragging behind, yeah.
Great, any more questions on the kind of question?
Curious if the speed limit will change on Main Street. What is
It was 12 today, but it might slow down a little bit more. Is there a speed limit on Main Street? Stop and go.
Does anyone know?
It's 25 speed limit. It's not posted because it's a downtown district.
We find that the two-way street, non-street parking, that creates enough friction that you'll notice slower speeds.
Challenge to go 25.
I was just going to suggest, since ODOT is such a critical stakeholder in all of this, and we have a representative of ODOT in the room, I want to invite her to speak.
She came in after we started, so it would, thank you for reminding me. I would like to, Nicole Curtis, she's a senior planner with ODOT, and she works with the city on all of our land use applications this year. Thank you. Do you have anything to add on that? Just to say,
We didn't have you in a microphone, so thank you for creating spots. Welcome.
Just to say that we support the public input and the local process and the involvement of the merchants, and for Oregon City to determine what's in your best interest. So we're on the sidelines waiting.
We really appreciate that. This is a partnership that needs to work. Planning Commissioner. Any more questions, Charles? You're done? Okay, Doug.
Just a quick one. I think if the notion is that we might have parking spaces where we have the alleyways on Main Street, that decision has to be made quickly because we don't want to move parking meters 2 times.
right, I agree with you.
And I think that occurs that you've got to talk about all the business owners there that in fact are on the alleyways. Well, I heard Bush's support for it. Yeah.
What we need to do very quickly is meet with everybody that would be impacted and find out what their needs are and see if they can just access from the alley and not through the street. I hate to have my final comment be about money. The big, what do they call it, the elephant in the room?
Yes.
Is the cost and the funding, and we have not identified funding yet. But at this point, I do know that ODOT and through the TGM process and even through the state economic development are really trying to see if there's some kind of funding available to assist the city with some of this work. So there's no promises being made, but I do know that they're, again, kind of awaiting what the city's desire is for the downtown. But I think there's a possibility of partnership for funding, not sure yet though.
So even if we pass this in next week, this is going to be before us, we don't have money to start at this point. Okay, let's be clear. Okay, well that's our time. Thank you very much. We'll have an opportunity again to review in a week, so thank you very much. Okay, we are adjourned. We'll reconvene at 6:20. Is that enough to reset? Maybe 6. Yeah, 6:25. It's time to reset. We are adjourned.